Hey everyone, this is Karenology. You won't believe the insane drama that just unfolded. Let's get into it. I was jolted awake at 2 a.m. by the kind of bass that rattles your ribs. My bedroom walls trembled, the window panes vibrated, and for a few seconds I actually thought there was an earthquake. But no, it was just my new neighbors, turning their backyard into a full-blown nightclub. Again. I groaned, rolled out of bed, and peeked through my blinds. Across the fence, neon lights pulsed in the darkness, flashing red and blue over a sea of partygoers. Music blasted from a set of speakers taller than a grown man, shaking the air. I could barely make out figures moving inside the chaos, drunken bodies swaying, beer bottles clinking, and people laughing like they didn't have work the next morning. I clenched my jaw. This wasn't just a loud get-together. This was the fourth time this week. I grabbed my phone and texted my neighbor's landlord, a woman named Susan, who had assured me when she rented the house that her tenants were quiet professionals. I doubted she had envisioned two 20-somethings running a makeshift rave every night. No response. Typical. I sighed and dialed the non-emergency police line. Noise complaint at 184 Maple Drive. It's the fourth time this week. The dispatcher sounded half asleep as she assured me they'd send someone when available. That usually meant never. I sat on the edge of my bed, waiting. 20 minutes later, a squad car rolled up, its lights off, as if they were trying not to ruin the party. Two officers stepped out, both looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. They knocked on the front door. A minute later, the music stopped. The backyard fell into silence, and one of the tenants, Justin, emerged, grinning. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I saw how it ended. The cops gave him a friendly nod and left. The second the police cruiser turned the corner, the bass dropped again, louder than before. I felt my pulse throb in my temples. They were mocking me. The next morning, I stepped outside to find my trash bins knocked over, their contents strewn across my driveway. A coincidence? Maybe. But I wasn't convinced. I grabbed my broom, sweeping up the mess, when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see Kelly, Justin's girlfriend, standing with a coffee in hand and an infuriating smirk on her face. "Rough night?" she asked, voice dripping with fake sympathy. I gritted my teeth. "You need to keep it down. People around here have jobs." She took a slow sip of her coffee, then shrugged. "It's just a little music. You should try relaxing. Might do you some good." I inhaled deeply, trying to keep my temper in check. "I've called the cops 4 times. If you don't stop, you're going to get fined." Kelly laughed, actually laughed. "Oh, sweetheart, the cops don't care. They love Justin. He plays on their softball team." I felt my stomach drop. That explained a lot. I realized then that I was dealing with more than just inconsiderate neighbors. These two thought they were untouchable. That night, I didn't bother calling the police. Instead, I did some research. I looked up noise ordinances, tenant laws, and the property ownership records. I discovered something interesting. The house wasn't owned by their landlord, Susan. It was still under the name of a deceased man, and it looked like there were unresolved tax issues. Armed with this information, I decided it was time to change tactics. I wasn't going to play fair anymore. At exactly 10 p.m., when the next party inevitably kicked off, I pulled out my phone and started recording. I captured the screaming, the music, the underage drinking. I zoomed in on the guests stumbling around with open containers, the illegal fire pit they'd built, and the fact that some of them were clearly lighting up joints in the backyard. Then I sent the footage to the county's noise violation office, the landlord, and, just for good measure, an old contact of mine who worked as a journalist for a local news outlet. If the cops weren't going to do anything, I'd make sure someone else did. The next morning, as I sipped my coffee on the porch, I watched Justin emerge from the house, stretching. His phone buzzed, and I saw his expression shift from cocky to pale in real time. He ran back inside, slamming the door. A few minutes later, Kelly came out looking furious. She scanned the street, her gaze locking onto me. I raised my mug and smiled. "Rough morning?" Kelly stormed across the lawn, her face twisted in barely contained fury. "What the hell did you do?" she snapped, stopping just short of my porch steps. I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the moment. "I have no idea what you're talking about," she scoffed. "Don't play dumb. Justin just got a call from the landlord, and the county's sending someone over about noise violations and possible illegal activity." "Did you seriously send videos?" I set my mug down, leaning back in my chair. "Maybe if you two weren't treating the neighborhood like your personal nightclub, people wouldn't have to take matters into their own hands." Her expression darkened. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" She jabbed a finger in my direction. "This is harassment. We have rights." "You sure do," I said, standing up. "And so do I. That includes the right to a peaceful home without my walls shaking at 2 in the morning. So if you and Justin want to party, I suggest finding a venue that isn't surrounded by people with jobs and responsibilities." She gave a humorless laugh. "You don't know who you're messing with." I raised an eyebrow. "No, Kelly, I don't think you know who you're messing with." She muttered something under her breath and stormed back inside, slamming the door so hard that my windows rattled. I went about my day, but my gut told me this wasn't over. Sure enough, that evening, just as the sun was setting, I heard the unmistakable sound of a car engine idling just outside my house. I peered through the blinds and spotted a black sedan parked across the street. Inside, a man in his 40s with a slicked-back haircut and a Bluetooth headset sat watching my house. I wasn't paranoid. I knew what intimidation tactics looked like. The longer he sat there, the more I knew this wasn't some coincidence. I stepped outside, making sure he saw me. He didn't flinch, just kept staring. I pulled out my phone and took a slow, deliberate photo of his car, making sure he saw that too. I took another step forward, lifting my phone as if I was recording. Only then did he put the vehicle into gear and drive off, but not before giving me a slow, pointed smirk that sent a chill up my spine. An hour later, as I was finishing up dinner, there was a loud knock at my door. When I opened it, 2 uniformed police officers stood on my porch, their expressions unreadable. The taller of the 2 adjusted his belt and cleared his throat. "Good evening, sir. We received a complaint about you threatening your neighbors. Would you mind answering a few questions?" I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to stay calm. I'd expected retaliation, but I hadn't expected it this fast. "Threatening?" I repeated, keeping my voice level. "That's interesting, because I have a security camera that's been recording all day, and the only people making threats have been them." One of the officers exchanged a glance with the other. "Would you be willing to show us the footage?" "Gladly," I said, stepping aside. "Come on in, let's take a look." I pulled up the recordings from my system, fast-forwarding to the part where Kelly stormed up to my house, fists clenched, practically foaming at the mouth. Then I showed them the black sedan lurking across the street, the driver making a show of watching my house for a full hour before I confronted him. The officers leaned in, watching intently. "Doesn't look like you did anything wrong," one of them admitted, "but we do have to file a report on this. Might be good to keep a low profile for a while." I forced a tight smile. I'd love nothing more than to be left alone. The officers gave me a nod and left, but as I watched their car disappear down the street, I had a sinking feeling that this wasn't over. I glanced back toward Kelly and Justin's house. Their blinds twitched. They were watching. I knew that look. They weren't backing down, and neither was I. The next morning, my suspicions were confirmed when I stepped outside and found a folded note taped to my mailbox. The handwriting was neat but aggressive. "You've made a mistake. You don't know what's coming." I let out a humorless chuckle and crumpled the paper in my fist. They really thought they could scare me. That day, I made some calls. If they wanted a fight, I was going to make damn sure they regretted ever starting one. The first sign that things were about to escalate came early the next morning. I was pouring my coffee when my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I let it ring out, assuming it was spam, but when it immediately rang again, I picked up. A distorted voice crackled through the speaker. "Drop the complaints or you'll regret it." I didn't respond. I just hung up, set my coffee down, and pulled up my security footage from the night before. Sure enough, around 3 a.m., A dark SUV had idled in front of my house for almost 15 minutes before pulling away. I zoomed in, catching just enough of the plate to make a report. If they thought they could scare me into silence, they had severely underestimated me. I forwarded the footage to a lawyer friend, along with a transcript of the call. She responded immediately. "You should report this now. This is harassment, possibly even a criminal threat. Don't wait." So I didn't. I drove straight to the precinct and gave them everything. The officer at the desk looked exhausted and unimpressed, but when I played the voicemail for him, his expression shifted. "We'll add it to the report," he muttered, scribbling something down. "But these things are hard to trace. You sure you don't have any direct evidence linking this to your neighbors?" "Not yet," I admitted, "but give me time." That evening, the real battle began. Around 8 p.m., just as I was settling into a movie, a deafening blast of bass shook my walls. I expected another party, but when I looked outside, there wasn't a single guest. It was just Justin, standing on his deck, arms crossed, smirking as he let the speakers blare at full volume. I stepped outside and gestured at him. "Really? You think this is going to break me?" He just laughed, tossing a beer bottle onto his lawn. "What's the matter? Can't handle a little music? Thought you were tougher than that." I sighed, already dialing the police. "I hope you've got a good lawyer, Justin." "Oh, don't worry about me," he shot back. "Worry about yourself." 10 minutes later, just as I expected, no squad car showed up. But something else did. A drone, buzzing just above my yard, its little red light blinking like an eye. I frowned, watching as it hovered near my bedroom window before darting away. Then another appeared, this one hovering near my car, camera pointed directly at me. They weren't just messing with me now. They were watching me. Enough was enough. I grabbed my laptop and did a little digging. If these idiots thought they were untouchable, they were wrong. With a bit of effort, I tracked down their rental agreement, along with a few not-so-legal details. Turns out, Justin and Kelly had never signed an official lease. They were subletting under the table, and Susan, their so-called landlord, was pocketing cash without filing paperwork. I didn't stop there. I dug through county records and found out that the property taxes hadn't been paid in over 2 years. That meant not only was the rental illegal, but the house itself could be subject to seizure if the city decided to crack down. It was more than I could have hoped for. The next morning, I made 2 calls. One to the city's rental authority and another to the IRS tip line. If Susan wanted to look the other way while her tenants tormented the neighborhood, I was about to make sure she paid for it. And just to make sure this got noticed, I anonymously forwarded everything to a local investigative journalist known for exposing shady landlords. At noon, I sat on my porch, sipping my coffee as a black SUV rolled up in front of Justin's house. A man in a suit stepped out, clipboard in hand, knocking on their door. Justin answered, looking annoyed. But as the conversation continued, his posture stiffened. He looked past the agent, straight at me, rage flickering behind his eyes. I just smiled and raised my mug. Within an hour, another vehicle arrived. This time, it was a county official with a camera, taking photos of the house and the surrounding area. Justin and Kelly stood on their porch, whispering furiously to each other. They knew they had a real problem now. I expected them to retaliate, but I didn't expect what came next. That night, around 2 a.m., my doorbell rang. I grabbed my phone and checked the security cam feed. No one was there. Just as I exhaled, ready to go back to sleep, my phone buzzed again with an alert, motion detected in the backyard. I switched cameras and my blood ran cold. There was a figure standing just outside my back fence, barely visible in the darkness, watching my house. I didn't sleep the rest of the night, and I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The morning after the eerie figure had appeared by my back fence, I made a decision. I wasn't just going to sit around and wait for whatever these lunatics had planned next. I started my day by reinforcing my security system, upgrading my motion sensors, and repositioning my cameras to cover every blind spot. If they were going to play games, they were about to realize I wasn't some defenseless victim. By noon, I had compiled everything. every incident, every threat, every piece of video evidence, and emailed it to a friend of mine who worked as a private investigator. "Look into them," I wrote. "I need every bit of dirt you can find." Within an hour, he called me. "You're not going to like this," he said. "Justin has a record. Couple of arrests for disorderly conduct and one for assault. Nothing major, but enough to show he's not just some harmless idiot." "And Kelly? She's been evicted twice for harassment complaints. They know how to push people." That only strengthened my resolve. I spent the afternoon watching my footage from the night before. The shadowy figure had stood still for over 5 minutes before finally walking away, disappearing toward Justin and Kelly's house. I zoomed in as much as I could, but it wasn't clear enough to make out details. Still, I knew. It had to be them or someone they had sent. As the sun set, I braced myself for whatever came next. Like clockwork, the music started at exactly 9 p.m., but this time it was different. Instead of blasting from their backyard speakers, it was coming from a car parked in front of my house. A black sedan with tinted windows, stereo on full blast, bass thumping so hard my windows vibrated. I stepped onto my porch, phone in hand, recording. The moment my camera light hit the car, the music cut off and the car sped away. I wasn't stupid. I knew they were testing me, seeing how far they could push before I snapped. But they underestimated me. The next morning, I paid a visit to the city's zoning office. After a few questions and some digging, I found exactly what I needed. The property Justin and Kelly were renting was technically zoned as a single-family residence, meaning they weren't legally allowed to host events or operate what was essentially an illegal club. By the time I left the office, I had a printed copy of the zoning codes in hand. I mailed an official complaint to the city, along with copies of my evidence. Then, for good measure, I called an old friend who worked as a city inspector and let him know what was going on. "Give it a week," he told me. "They won't see it coming." That night, as I sat on my porch, watching their house, I saw the moment Justin got a notification on his phone. He read it, scowled, then immediately started making frantic calls. Kelly stormed outside, waving her phone around as she shouted at him. Whatever they had just learned, it wasn't good news for them. I expected them to retaliate, and I was right. The next morning, I found my mailbox smashed, its contents scattered across my driveway. A single note was taped to my door. "Back off." I laughed. They thought a broken mailbox and a few threats were going to scare me? They had no idea what they had just unleashed. That night, I set up extra cameras and waited. Around 1 a.m., motion sensors triggered on my side yard. I switched to the live feed and saw 2 shadowy figures creeping toward my back fence. They stayed low, moving carefully, avoiding the main camera angles. But they didn't know about the new infrared cam I had just installed. I recorded everything. One of them tried to pry open my fence gate, but as soon as they touched it, an alarm blared. They bolted, vanishing into the night. I immediately called the police. "You've got attempted trespassing on video," I told them, "and I think I know who it is." When the officers arrived, I handed them the footage. One of them frowned as he watched. "That's enough to start an investigation. You want to press charges?" "Absolutely." The next morning, I sent copies of the footage to the zoning office, my lawyer, and, just for fun, the investigative journalist I had been in contact with. By noon, city officials had already arrived at Justin and Kelly's house. Justin came outside, furious. "You think you can ruin us," he shouted. "You have no idea what you're messing with." I crossed my arms, meeting his glare. "Neither do you." That evening, I received an anonymous text. "This isn't over. Watch your back." I smiled as I saved the message. It was exactly what I had been hoping for. They were panicking, and that meant I was winning. I spent the next few hours setting up even more security measures. I repositioned my cameras, adding extra coverage to the front and back yards. I installed motion-activated floodlights, ensuring there wouldn't be any more blind spots for them to exploit. If they were going to come back, I'd be ready. The next day, I contacted a few more of my neighbors, quietly explaining the situation. Some of them had already suspected Justin and Kelly were trouble, but now they had proof. A few even volunteered to give statements to the city officials. The more complaints filed, the harder it would be for them to get away with this. Late that night, I heard movement outside again. This time, instead of hiding, I walked right onto my porch, flashlight in hand. The second my light cut through the darkness, I saw two figures darting back toward Justin's house. One of them tripped over the curb, cursing as he scrambled up. I chuckled, watching them disappear. Let them run. They were losing control, and they knew it. The morning after the failed break-in, I woke up to find an official-looking notice taped to my front door. I peeled it off, scanning the fine print. It was a cease and desist letter, supposedly from a law firm representing Justin and Kelly. The wording was full of legal jargon, but the message was clear. They were accusing me of harassment, intimidation, and making false claims to authorities. I almost laughed. It was a desperate move, and they knew it. I wasn't stupid. I called my lawyer immediately, forwarded him a copy, and within an hour, he confirmed what I already suspected. The firm listed in the letter didn't exist. They had mocked up a fake legal threat, probably assuming I'd be scared enough to back off. Instead, I decided to go on the offensive. My lawyer drafted a real cease and desist, complete with a defamation warning, and sent it directly to them. That night, the tension reached a boiling point. I had just finished dinner when I heard a loud crash outside. I ran to my porch and found my car's windshield shattered, glass glittering across the pavement. My fists clenched as I checked the security footage. The grainy video showed a masked figure hurling a rock at my car before sprinting back toward Justin's house. That was it. They had crossed the line. I called the police, and this time they actually took it seriously. Maybe it was because of the growing pile of reports, or maybe the footage of a masked vandal finally forced their hand. Either way, within 20 minutes, 2 squad cars pulled up in front of Justin's house. I stood on my porch, arms crossed, watching as officers pounded on their door. Justin opened it, looking groggy, but his expression quickly darkened as they started questioning him. Kelly appeared behind him, arms folded, her face pale under the porch light. The conversation got heated. Justin was gesturing wildly, shaking his head, denying everything. But then one of the officers held up a phone, showing him the footage. I didn't need to hear what was being said. I could see the moment Justin realized he was screwed. His shoulders slumped, and for the first time he looked nervous. After nearly 30 minutes of arguing, the officers finally turned him around and cuffed him. Kelly started yelling, but they ignored her, guiding Justin toward the squad car. One of the officers approached me. He's being taken in for questioning. We can't charge him with anything yet, but this is enough to escalate things. Keep your footage. We'll be in touch. I nodded, my pulse steady. This wasn't over, but it was a major blow to them. The next morning, I woke up to something unexpected. Silence. No music, no shouting, no revving engines. I stepped outside, half expecting another attack, but instead, I saw a moving truck parked in front of Justin and Kelly's house. A couple of guys were loading boxes into the back while Kelly stood on the lawn, arms crossed, looking furious. Justin was nowhere to be seen. I grabbed my coffee, walked to the edge of my driveway, and watched. She noticed me and shot a glare so venomous I thought she might actually lunge at me. Instead, she turned sharply, storming into the house. I had won. By the end of the day, the house was empty. The truck pulled away, and just like that, the neighborhood was peaceful again. I stood on my porch as the sun set, taking in the silence. It had been a long, exhausting battle, but I had fought back, and I had won. Later that evening, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I hesitated before opening it. Enjoy your peace while it lasts. No name, no context, but I knew exactly who it was from. I smiled, deleted the message, and walked inside. They could stew in their bitterness all they wanted. This was my home, and no one was going to take that from me. For the next few days, I watched the empty house across the street with caution. There were no signs of life, no visitors, and no more surprises. But something told me this wasn't over. One evening, just as I was locking up, I saw a car slow down in front of my house. The driver didn't stop, just rolled by, headlights off, as if surveying the area. I made a note of the license plate. The following morning, a new problem arose. I received an anonymous complaint from the city citing me for excessive use of security cameras that could be considered an invasion of privacy. I knew exactly who was behind it. Someone was still trying to make my life difficult. I filed a counter-complaint, including all my documentation, and ensured that my cameras were well within legal limits. By the end of the week, a new couple had moved into Justin and Kelly's former house. I introduced myself, pretending I hadn't spent the past several months locked in a battle with their predecessors. They seemed normal enough, polite, quiet. Maybe, just maybe, this nightmare was finally over. Or so I thought. A few nights later, my doorbell rang. I checked the security feed before opening it, expecting a delivery. Instead, a man in a dark hoodie stood at the edge of my porch, head slightly bowed. He didn't knock again, didn't move. He just stood there. I turned on the porch light. He didn't flinch. I opened the door just a crack. "Can I help you?" I asked. The man lifted his head, revealing a face I didn't recognize. "You should be careful who you make enemies with," he said. Then he turned and walked off into the night. I didn't sleep at all that night.